next month, it will be illegal to smack your child in Wales. And parents could end up with a criminal record if they are reported to the police.
Now, this follows Scotland. They introduced a very similar ban back in 2019. But it is still currently legal to hit your own child in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, provided you can make the case that it was reasonable punishment. But is it ever OK?
Well, joining us now, Rebecca Wilcox, who is a journalist and whose mum is Esther Ranson, who founded Childline. Now, Rebecca says smacking has a negative impact and is never all right.
And Dr. Stuart Wayton, a sociology and criminology lecturer, who says that light smacking is not the same as domestic violence and shouldn't be punished, as it were, in turn. But let's start with you, Rebecca. I've got mixed feelings about this, and I'll tell you for why. And I've gone public about this before. When I was a little boy, I was hit quite a lot by my dad, who I loved very much and was a great father, and it was typical of the day. We're talking about the 1960s. But I was hit with a stick. And reflecting on it now, if it had been outlawed, if corporal punishment, as it were, had been outlawed then, I wouldn't have been hit. He wouldn't have broken the law. Is that one of the reasons, that knock-on effect, that it would actually prevent parents? It would make them stop and think if this ban was introduced?
Well, it's been proven that if you make it illegal, it's a form of education. It's not criminalising parents to send them to prison. It's educating them that actually smacking has a negative impact on mental health all the way through childhood, all the way through adolescence. You know, it's not that long ago that we criminalised domestic violence. In the 70s, there was that awful phrase, rule of thumb. That was how big the stick could be to hit your wife. And it feels like we are evolving out of violence. We need to evolve out of violence. We should not be smacking. That is not discipline. Discipline means teaching. That is exactly what that word means. It is not punishment. You don't want to create fear. It's all about, I think it's about the adult losing control. Whenever I have felt the urge to smack my children, and I have felt that urge, just to be really honest, it's about my control. It's about me losing it. It's never about my child.
Yes, well, full disclosure, I mean, as my children were growing up, I'd certainly never used a stick. But once or twice, I think with Jack, who was the firstborn, I think I sort of tapped his bottom a couple of times with the flat of my hand. And you know what? I always felt that was a point of failure. My failure. I felt ashamed of it.
Yes, it's never something you're ever going to be proud of. If I've ever felt that, and I have, my child broke my laptop once when I had a deadline. It was an awful moment, and I gave him a smack on the bottom, and it's one of my biggest regrets. It's my, you know, we always talk about parenting fails in an amusing way. This was not amusing. It was my fault. There's always another way. There's always a conversation. There's always, you know, maybe I needed a timeout, not the child.
Dr. Stuart Wayton, you are a lecturer in sociology and criminology as well. If it is a crime to hit your husband, your wife or your partner, how is it ever justified to hit your child?
Well, I think it's a very curious argument that you think about children and adults in the same way. So if I saw, like, you know, I smack my children occasionally, whereas if you saw me smacking my 4-year-old child because he ran across a busy road, and then you saw me beating up my wife, and you thought they were the same thing, I would think there was something wrong with you. Right, and I think there is something profoundly wrong with that argument.
Either smacking your child or your wife, I would think there was something wrong.
Well, if you can't make a distinction between a loving parent trying to discipline their children and a brute who is beating up his wife, then I think the problem is yours. And I think that's a real problem with this argument, is an inability to distinguish between adults and children. I mean, it's funny in this argument that we're saying, oh, you know, adults shouldn't use force, you know, they should use education and all the rest of it. Well, if the people who don't like smacking want to change this, well, perhaps we should just have arguments and discussions rather than the force of the law. I mean, this is so in Scotland, you already had criminalised hard smacking with sticks, you know, as Richard was suggesting there. That was already illegal. What they made illegal was that, right? So a slap on the back of the hand or the bottom is now a criminal offence. Right, now, I think for most ordinary people, that makes no sense at all, right, who've smacked their children occasionally, who love their children, who bring their children up. This idea that it creates violent children into the future, it doesn't really add up, doesn't make sense. People can see that that's not really true. It just seems to be a form of extremism where people's moral positions or moralising positions about what they think is right and wrong
Well, you make
are forced on people. And you don't have to be a fan of smacking. No. You don't have to be a fan of smacking. You can just think, well, actually, parents should be able to make those decisions.
Well, you make a very clear and articulate case for it, I have to say. But if we can just go back to Rebecca, I would say that the reaction for people who agree with him is typified by a tweet we've got here saying, I was smacked from time to time as a child. It never did me any harm. What would you say to people who say, well, I've been through the experience, I've been smacked as a child, I'm fine?
I would say that if you go on Google, you'll find 70 studies from around the world that prove that is wrong. Smacking as a child leads to aggression in adults. I mean, maybe the situation in Ukraine would be different if everybody wasn't smacked. The fact is, it is not debated scientifically about whether smacking is bad for the child. It has been proven time and time again through countless studies at countless universities. I'm very surprised by Dr. Stewart that he, as an academic, doesn't read these studies, that it shows it doesn't work, that it actually negatively impacts children and leads to aggression in adults.
All right, I think we'll just have to, the two of you will have to agree to differ. But thank you both very much indeed. And thanks for all the messages we've got on this. Pretty evenly split out there.